We all faced obstacles that we've gotta overcome in life, but they're likely nothing compared to the woman who had to live in a 180-foot tall redwood tree for over 2 years, coming up against everything from attacking helicopters to ferocious thunderstorms. Intrigued? Well, get your harness at the ready as we uncover the unbelievable story of Julia Butterfly Hill, the woman who lived in a tree for 738 days. To start our story, we've got to go back to the 70s, 1974 to be precise. This was the year Julia Lorraine Hill was born in Mount Vernon, Missouri. Julia's father was a traveling preacher, briefly staying at each church he visited. Hopping from town to town, the family never had time to settle. In fact, until she was about 10 years old, Julia lived in a 32-foot camper van with her father, mother, and 2 younger brothers. Unsurprisingly, the tiny camper was crowded. Little did Julia know, living, eating, and sleeping in confined quarters would be the perfect training for what was to come. Living out of a camper van also meant Julia didn't have many toys or clothes like other kids her age. Instead, she explored rivers and looked out for any wildlife to follow. In fact, Julia's life was so different to the rest, she didn't even start school when she turned 5. Her parents decided, with their on-the-move lifestyle, it'd be best for juvenile Julia to be homeschooled, or camper van schooled, more like. In fairness, she learned to read, write, and solve math problems in her family camper. However, her favorite lessons took place in the great outdoors. The whole family enjoyed hiking in forests together. On one hike, when Julia was just 6 years old, something incredible happened. As she was trekking through the shrubbery, a monarch butterfly landed on her finger. Even more amazingly, it wouldn't budge, resting there for the entire hike. So gobsmacked were her brothers, they gave their older sister the nickname Butterfly. And from that day on, she became known as Julia Butterfly Hill. By the time she was 10, Julia's family settled down in Arkansas, so that meant, finally, she could start going to school. Julia was finally learning about the periodic table and Pythagoras' theorem, although the strict school schedule also meant she spent less time exploring all things nature. Nevertheless, Julia went on to graduate from high school before heading off to college. During her time there, the teenager made ends meet by modeling for a clothing company and working as a restaurant waitress. Following one of her waitress shifts, something happened that would change Julia's life forever. While driving home, she was waiting at a red light. Then, all of a sudden, both Julia and her car were rocked forward. Shockingly, a drunk driver going full speed in a Ford Bronco had rammed into the back of her car. The near-fatal crash saw Julia bedbound in the hospital for weeks. It took almost a year of intense therapy for her to finally regain the ability to speak and walk. During her lengthy rehabilitation, Julia had plenty of time to reflect on her life. After months of thinking and reflection, she came to the conclusion that her life was out of balance. Her nature-loving past was a fading memory. Instead, her life now revolved around career and material possessions. While that would sound A-okay for most of us, Julia was more interested in devoting her time to making a positive impact on the future. It didn't take long for this nature lover to stick to her word. Shortly after recuperating from her accident, she and some friends paid a visit to a forest of redwood trees in Humboldt County, California. If you didn't know, redwood trees, with their reddish-brown hue, are among the tallest trees in the world, often exceeding 300 feet. That's around the height of the Statue of Liberty. So rangy are redwoods, they can create entire ecosystems. Yep, hundreds of flora like ferns, moss, and lichen have been found living in the canopies of redwoods. This, in turn, provides food for the swarms of insects and amphibians that also call these trees home. As well as that, many more species of bird and various mammals like bats and squirrels nest and find food among the foliage. But that's not the only way in which redwoods are hugely helpful for the environment. Thanks to their large size, long lifespan, and rot-resistant wood, redwood trees can capture at least 3 times more carbon dioxide from the air than standard trees before transforming it into the oxygen we breathe. Yep, so these guys essentially hoover up greenhouse gases. How tremendous. Down below the surface, these genius giants help out too. Typically, a redwood's roots will extend no more than 12 feet underground. Instead, they travel outwards, sometimes extending up to 100 feet out from the trunk. This massive root system allows them to intertwine their roots with each other, providing support and stability for these formidable flora. Crucially, redwood's expansive root system also helps to bind soil together, anchoring it in place. On top of that, their roots absorb large amounts of water from the soil, preventing saturation. This, along with their large trunks and dense canopy, which help break the force of wind and rain, massively reduce the rates of soil erosion. And considering soil erosion worsens the land's ability to absorb water, leading to increased surface runoff, as well as a high risk of flooding and landslides, that's pretty important. Julia was in agreement. After visiting the redwood forest in Humboldt County, she was so in awe she dropped to her knees and began to cry, overwhelmed by the wisdom, energy, and spirituality the forest gave her. Considering how terrific these trees sound, who can blame her? Sadly, though, not everyone shared Julia's sentiment. On New Year's Eve 1996, heavy storms battered much of Humboldt County. The storms brought plenty of rain with them. Now, usually that wouldn't be much of a problem. However, the relentless rainfall sent a 20-foot wall of mud and rock sliding down the forest slopes and onto the small community of Stafford. Luckily, no one was seriously hurt, though more than 30 homes were damaged or destroyed. For residents, the culprit was clear. They were certain that Pacific Lumber Company's logging of redwood trees in the area had weakened the soil, making it vulnerable to heavy rainfall. Wait, let's rewind real quick. Pacific who? All right, it's time for a quick logging lesson. First founded in 1863, the family-owned business, otherwise known as Palco, were widely praised for their sustainable forestry practices. Then, in 1985, Charles Hurwitz, a Texan billionaire and head of Maxim Corporation, acquired the company. Yet environmentalists argued that in order to finance the $800 million of debt incurred in the takeover, Palco aggressively stepped up its rate of redwood logging. Now, as we already know, one of the many negative effects of logging is the greater risk of soil erosion, which can potentially trigger tragic events like the Stafford landslide. Despite that, Pacific Lumber Company refused to take responsibility for the act. Instead, the company said the blowout was an act of God. Well, let's just say Stafford's residents thought Palco were barking up the wrong tree. After offering the residents a measly $1,000 each, the company began logging the remaining area of forest around Stafford, including the Stafford Giant, a 1,000-year-old, 180-foot-tall redwood. Although the logging company was engaging in environmentally dangerous practices, legal efforts to stop them had failed. Yet by the 1990s, only 5% of California's redwood forests remained. So, environmentalists willing to commit civil disobedience organized protests in the redwood forests in an effort to prevent their destruction. After learning about the threat to her beloved trees, Julia joined Earth First, a radical environmentalist group that opposed the Pacific Lumber Company's logging in Humboldt County. By late 1997, in an attempt to dissuade the ever-increasing logging in the area, the disruption tactics of Earth First became more and more outlandish. The most ambitious of these involved the Stafford Giant, the humongous tree found within the forest area owned by Palco. Members of Earth First constructed 2 platforms up in the tree. with the hope that someone could provide a human presence up in the redwood, preventing its destruction. In December of 1997, Earth First were looking for a volunteer to sit in the Stafford Giant. It was anticipated to only take a few weeks of tree sitting before Palco would give up and move on to some other forest to log. Saying that, sitting up in a redwood tree for 2 weeks in the freezing December conditions doesn't sound like the best way to celebrate the Christmas season. Unsurprisingly, nobody was too keen. Then Julia, remembering her devotion to make a positive impact on the future, put herself forward. What she didn't know, however, is that this tree sit would be far longer and more terrifying than she could ever imagine. So, on December 10th, 1997, the 23-year-old began her colossal climb. Since the moon was rising at the time she was climbing, activists chose to name the tree Luna, which is Latin for moon. And just like the moon, Luna was high up, really high up. Luna stretched some 180 feet above the ground, making this towering tree around the height of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. To get a real sense of how hugely high this tree went up, take a look at this. Man, think how tiring that ascent must have been. Finally, after hours of harnessing her way up the redwood, Julia reached the platform. So exhausting was the climb, she immediately collapsed. But that was the easy part. Now came the not-so-small task of actually living up a tree. Julia had 2 platforms in the tree. The lower of the 2, found around 100 feet up, was a 6 by 8 foot slab of wood that served as her living space. For context, that's around half the size of an average bedroom. You won't be surprised to know that this wasn't the fanciest living space going either. A sheet of blue tarp was tied to the trunk to act as a roof. And as for a bed, well, all Julia had was a sleeping bag. Another platform, at a loftier height of 180 feet, was used as a storage space. Whether it was climbing gear, extra clothes, cleaning supplies, or food, this place had everything Julia needed to see her through her time up Luna. Now, speaking of food, you're probably wondering how exactly she managed to get some sustenance 100 plus feet above the ground. And before your mind runs off with thoughts of her chowing down on any bird neighbors that she might come across in the canopy, Julia, being an eco-warrior, was vegan. Instead, once a week, an 8-member support crew at the bottom of the tree hoisted food and supplies up using a pulley system. Typically, Hill's diet would consist of raw fruit and vegetables, although she also possessed a camping stove and cooking utensils, allowing her to whip up dishes like her famously delicious potato squash stew. Imagine how cool it'd be to have those views while tucking into your dinner. Now, as you know, though, all that food had to go somewhere eventually. Catch my drift? Fortunately for anyone stationed at the bottom of the Stafford Giant, they didn't have to watch their head for any dirty droppings. Instead, she'd do her business in a garbage bag-lined bucket before sealing it up and lowering it to the ground when her support team were present. If that wasn't gross enough, Hill barely washed. I mean, what chance do you have of finding a shower up a tree? Instead, poor Julia had to make do with a small basin filled with water that she'd use for an occasional sponge bath. And I mean, very occasional. In the first few months up there, she bathed just 3 times. Yikes. Interestingly, when Julia did bathe, she wouldn't wash the soles of her feet. It may sound disgusting at first, but Julia's unwashed soles stuck to the tree sap better, allowing her to move about the tree's canopy without the fear of falling down. Tarzan, eat your heart out. As weeks became months, Julia still remained in the tree. So what was the holdup? After all, this tree sit job was only meant to last a couple of weeks. Well, sadly for Julia, Palco were refusing to budge. Annoyingly for the lumber company, though, as the months progressed, Julia's mind-boggling feat was becoming more and more newsworthy. By the time spring had sprung in 1998, she'd virtually become a celebrity. In fact, most of her days up Luna were typically spent reading through hundreds of fan mail letters she'd receive, as well as conducting radio interviews through her solar-powered cell phone. Reporters and photographers even braved the 2-hour climb to get up close and personal with the star. At this point, Julia was the queen of the forest. In fact, it wasn't just ordinary folk who were looking to pay Miss Hill a visit. Singer-activists Joan Baez and Bonnie Raitt also dropped by, or climbed more like, with Baez calling it one of the most remarkable experiences of her life. Yep, Julia Hill's extraordinary activism work was reaching heady heights, and I don't just mean because she was 180 feet off the ground. But just as Julia's profile was raising, so were the threats against her. For some context, the 1990s were a time where tensions between loggers and activists were at their fear crest. In 1997, Humboldt County police officers dabbed the eyes of activists surrounding trees with cotton swabs soaked in pepper spray. Man, those guys really weren't messing around. 1 year later, David Chain, among several other activists, was protesting through the forests of Humboldt County when disaster struck, or should I say, fell. One timber worker named Arlington Emmons was getting increasingly more furious about the presence of protesters in the forest. Activists even recorded Emmons swearing and threatening them. Sadly, those threats would soon be realized. Apparently, after spotting some activists sitting down for some lunch, Emmons started to hack down a 135-foot redwood. As the tree fell, it collapsed onto Chain. Yeah, as you can imagine, it didn't end well for him. Incredibly, despite the mountain of evidence against Emmons, the Humboldt County District decided not to charge him for Chain's passing, putting the tragedy down to bad luck. Okay, so now you know. The redwood forests of Northern California weren't a safe place to be in the late 1990s, especially if you found yourself camped up a redwood tree. And it's fair to say it didn't take long before Hill's life was in danger too. One morning, as she was still waking up, the activist noticed something strange. There was a vicious whirring sound getting closer and closer. While strange sounds in towns and cities are commonplace, they're not something you'd expect to hear while you're all alone at a height of over 100 feet above the forest floor. As the sound got closer and closer, Julia started to get blown away. Then, all of a sudden, with Julia desperately clinging onto Luna, there it was, whizzing above her. It was a helicopter sent from Palco, intended to intimidate Hill into descaling the shrub. Though the threatening chopper eventually flew away, Julia's troubles were far from over. Figuring the next best way to break Hill's spirit was to cut off her supplies and food from coming in, Palco effectively besieged Luna. For no less than 10 days, the area surrounding Luna was roped off, while 3 security guards stood at the base of the tree, stopping anyone from getting supplies to Julia. As the days ticked by, she was running extremely low on food, and her phone was fast running out of battery. With her last bit of juice, Julia phoned some fellow activists to hatch a cunning plan to stop the siege. A swarm of activists hiked up to a hill near to Luna, where they jumped around and shouted in an attempt to catch the attention of the security guards. With the guards distracted by the strange sight and sound, a few other of Julia's companions quickly clipped a bag of supplies onto the rope, which she hauled up, all before any of the guards could notice. Genius. But the victory would soon get even sweeter for Julia. Embarrassed that they'd been fooled, the security guards decided that they may as well pack up, leaving the forest the very next day. It seemed nobody could match Julia's determination and resilience. Yet Palco's intimidation tactics weren't the only terrifying threat facing Julia. Unsurprisingly, living way up in a tree with nothing to keep you cozy but some tarp and a sleeping bag isn't luxurious, especially in winter. During the colder months, temperatures dropped to a chilly 40 degrees. Exposure to such cold conditions over an extended period of time can lead to hypothermia, where the blood loses heat faster than it can produce it. And considering hypothermia can be fatal, it's not something you want to experience perched 180 feet up in the air. Fortunately, by wrapping herself tight in a sleeping bag, leaving only a small hole for breathing, Julia just about survived the frosty conditions. There would be worse, though. She also had to face fierce thunderstorms. One particular storm, named El Niño, ripped through the forest with blistering 90-mile-per-hour winds that lasted some 16 hours. Julia herself said, "Imagine you're on a bucking bronco. Put that bronco on a ship at sea in the middle of a storm, then put that 180 feet in the air." Sounds terrifying, doesn't it? Fearing for her life, Julia grabbed Luna's trunk and started praying. She passed out, yet miraculously, she later woke up, still clinging to the redwood. She'd survived the storm. Clearly, nothing could break Julia and Luna's bond. Initially, Palco refused to negotiate with Hill. As their CEO, John Campbell, explained, she was breaking the law, she was trespassing, and you don't negotiate with people who are breaking the law. However, as the months turned into years, and everything from hateful helicopters to surging storms failed to discourage Hill, Palco finally admitted defeat. In late 1999, a resolution was reached. Palco agreed to preserve the Stafford giant, as well as all other trees within a 200-foot radius. In exchange, Hill would vacate her Heidi home. However, as part of the agreement, Hill and her supporters would also pay $50,000 to Palco, making up for lost logging revenue in the area. Fortunately, the company decided it'd be best to donate the sizable sum to Humboldt State University for forestry studies. With the agreement in place, Julia could finally leave Luna, safe in the knowledge that the tree wouldn't be felled and turned into tissue paper. On December 18, 1999, 738 days after Julia climbed up the redwood, she finally came down again. Thank goodness. I mean, had she lived in that tree any longer, who knows? Maybe she would have become half woman, half trunk. Boo. Can you imagine being trapped in the canopy of a redwood for over 24 months? I don't think I'd last 24 minutes before crying for my mama. Unsurprisingly, when Julia finally touched down from her tree, she collapsed in the mud before exclaiming, "We did it." No, Julia, you did it. Despite getting won over Palco, Julia's work was far from done. She continued to advocate against the practice of logging on her various talk show appearances. On top of that, the terrific tree sitter became an author, motivational speaker, and co-founder of the Circle of Life Foundation, a platform that produces speaking tours, eco-friendly events, classroom visits, and workshops. Yet for all her good work, not everyone was an advocate of Julia's eco-conscious cause. Tragically, in November 2000, less than a year after she'd completed the tree sit, Luna was cut into. Vandals, armed with a chainsaw, slashed a 32-inch deep gash around the base, just less than half the circumference of the tree's trunk. Thankfully, after the gash was treated with an herbal remedy and the tree was stabilized with steel cables, old Luna made a full recovery. Still, it went to show that despite all of Hill's heroics, her fight was far from finished. In 2002, Julia, along with several other climate activists, pitched outside the offices of Occidental Petroleum in Quito, Ecuador. This time, she wasn't protesting against logging, but a planned oil pipeline that had ripped through an Ecuadorian forest brimming with rare birds. Sadly, on this occasion, the protest fell on deaf ears, as Julia was detained by Ecuadorian authorities before being deported back to the U.S. Not satisfied in her efforts, Julia was out on the protest trail once again in 2006, this time to protect the South Central Farm in Los Angeles. At 14 acres, the South Central Farm was one of the largest urban farms in the U.S., providing a community space for gardening and a source for food for around 350 families. Yet despite its importance to the local community, the farm was sold in 2004, with farmers evicted in 2006. As a last-ditch effort to save the farm, Hill, among other protesters, participated in a 3-week-long tree sit, Considering her experience, that must have been a walk in the park. Even still, despite the environmentalists' efforts, the sale of the South Central farm still went through. Since then, Julia has largely remained out of the public spotlight. But even today, her legacy remains as strong as ever. She's been the subject of several documentaries, interviews, including her own 2000 memoir, The Legacy of Luna. On top of that, she's mentioned in songs by the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Neil Young, to name a few, and has even inspired The Simpsons episode, Lisa the Tree Hugger. But most importantly, Julia's dedicated devotion to the cause has inspired a whole generation of environmental activists who look up to her work in more ways than one. Okay, before we wrap up, have a think of what you can take from this story. Well, the lesson Julia can teach us is a simple one. No matter who you are in life, if you're determined and resilient enough, you can achieve anything you put your mind to, however high the climb may seem. And with all that in mind, who knows? Maybe in the future, one of your extraordinary feats will see The Simpsons create an episode in your honor. Even better, maybe I could be making a video about you one day. Now, think about this. What do you do when you're on public transport, cleaning your house, or you generally can't stare at a screen? Do you still want to learn amazing facts and have your mind blown? Well, I've got a solution. Be Amazed is now available in podcast form. Look up Be Amazed on all major podcast platforms. And that rounds up another video. Which part of Julia's jaw-dropping 738-day tree sit inspired you the most? Let me know down in the comments below, and thanks for watching.